some journalism and censorship in Bahrain. My name is Dewi Wen. It's D-E-W-I space W-I-N. I don't know, it's a bit weird that. It's geographically, Bahrain is a pretty small island and a few other surrounding islands in the middle of the Persian Gulf. And it's between 33 and 84 because there have been some land reclamation process where they're building artificial islands. And it's been ruled as one kingdom since 2002 because between 1971 and 2002 it considered itself a republic rather than a kingdom. Obviously it was still ruled by the Khalifa royal family then, it just didn't consider itself a kingdom for some reason. And it's got a very long causeway connecting itself to Saudi Arabia, and it's planning on building an even longer marine bridge to Qatar, which is to the south. And Bahrain, being one of the Persian Gulf nations, obviously has a lot of oil and natural gas underneath it, which is part of the reason it's got a decent amount of wealth. So for a lot of the previous century, Iran has claimed that Bahrain should be considered a region of Iran, and at one point Iran even passed a bill that left 2 empty seats in the Iranian parliament for 2 Bahraini representatives to sit in government, even though there were no Bahraini representatives. It's part of all the various League of Arab States and the United Nations and the GCC, which is a Gulf cooperation. So just before the First World War, the Bahrain Petroleum Company, which was a sub-company of the Californian Petroleum Company, discovered oil, and Bahrain had already had a long history with the British government before that. It's like a region that was partly controlled and often had the British Empire's Middle Eastern fleet docked in a port in Bahrain. So the British Empire built a lot of oil wells, and that led to quite a lot of modernisation, and this likely allowed the Al Khalifa royal family to solidify a bit more control over the nation, because they were given control over the main economic strength in Bahrain. So Bahrain has a parliament not unlike Britain, because there's a House of Representatives which is voted for by people. Like, there's 40 seats which each represent a different region of Bahrain, but then there's a higher house, which is their equivalent of the House of Lords, where high status people who are chosen by the royal family are appointed, and so they have quite a lot of control. And the king, obviously as a king, has a lot of power, and even though Bahrain might consider itself, or claims to be, a constitutional monarchy, the royal family has a lot more power than, say, Britain's royal family. And so obviously there's quite a lot of criticism of the royal family, even though the Al Khalifa family have been less violent and repressive than other Middle Eastern regimes. They do still use torture, which will be in a later slide. The Prime Minister, Sheikh Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa, who is an unelected Prime Minister since 1971, which I think is the longest running Prime Minister in the world, is the uncle of the current king, Sheikh Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa. It's obviously the brother of the king before Hamad. And you are not allowed to print a newspaper unless you get a license granted at the discretion of the Ministry of Information, who was chosen by the king, obviously. And then the Al Wasat newspaper, who was often critical of the regime, was closed in April 2011 among all the various Arab Spring uprisings on the grounds of attempting to undermine the nation and disseminate false information. Mansour al-Jamari, Walid Nouhid and Akil Mirza, the editor, managing editor and local news editor, were forced to resign, and there was a replacement. And also, I think 2 or 3 Iraqi Kurdish journalists were also forced to leave Bahrain, who I believe worked at Al-Wasat because they were part of the thing and they were part of the Al-Wasat, and the government had a valid reason to force them to leave because they considered them illegal immigrants, was the word. And then Karim Fakrawi was one of the co-founders of Al-Wasat, and during the Arab Spring and the uprisings, specifically in Bahrain, he was either taken into custody or abducted by the government authorities. And you're taken by the government under somewhat questionable circumstances, and then you die of kidney failure, then people are going to be suspicious. And so there were photos of a corpse which looked like it had been treated very brutally, were identified as Fakrawi. And obviously it seems that the government just needed to kill him because they didn't believe that he was safe to allow to keep printing the Al-Wasat. The Committee to Protect Journalists, they researched and decided that until that particular week, no journalist had died in Bahrain due to works to do with journalism. They'd just been taken into custody at most. But honestly, during the uprisings, the government got scared and started making somewhat irrational decisions. This is then, obviously, because of the Arab Spring, there was a domino effect, and the Bahraini citizens who were critical of the government took to the streets in protest, and the military and the police, which are under absolute control of the monarch, responded with fairly brutal attempts to control the streets. And as the Department of State says, the governmental forces caused deprivation of life, arrest individuals on charges relating to freedom of expression, violations of privacy and restrictions on civil liberties, as well as instances of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. So obviously, when the CIA are criticising you, you've probably done something quite bad in terms of infringing freedom. So, as well as many bloggers and internet journalists were threatened during that period as well. There's a book I found, Mustafa Safwan's Why Are the Arabs Not Free? The Politics of Writing. He thinks that maybe the reason that Arab nations have been less able, or have only recently, well, the book was published a few years before the Arab uprisings, but he believes that the higher-ups in the Arab world would prevent the normal citizens from speaking their mind by keeping ideals like freedom and liberty from being used in the common vernacular. Like, the normal day-to-day speech didn't have the same experience of being used for political ideals like the European languages might have done in the previous century because of all the French Revolution and everything. So he thinks that might be a reason that it's been so difficult for Arab nations to like rise up against the despotic regimes and the monarchies and such. So the BBC reported that self-censorship is very widespread. Like there's been the few people have already mentioned that it's very widespread in Egypt as well as Bahrain and such. And so that's just a good overview for that.
Okay, thank you very much.